Today, we will be talking about functional programming. We will be talking about functional programming, atomicity, why to use it, and my personal rules when working with this architecture. What is functional programming? Functional programming is an architecture approach where the primary concept that you're working with is atomicity. Atomicity is a fancy way of saying independent. It means that it works on its own. So it's like how in the universe you have atoms and molecules. Atoms are like the smallest parts of things that you can use. So it's like super small, it can't be divided. And in programming, it just means it's a small piece that can't actually go into anything else. It's self-contained, doesn't rely on anything else. Functional programmings have a single function. That's the whole idea. It may sound obvious to make code not rely on other code, and it kind of is at first, but when you have hundreds of lines of code, thousands of lines of code, hundreds of files, over time it gets difficult for you to separate things that are connected. And unless you're aware of the architecture and how this approach, it gets a little bit mangled. There are two main benefits really from using atomicity, well, functional programming, which is reliability and reusability. If you can see the code on the screen, there is a function, days since. This function just calculates the difference between the start date and the end days, so pretty simple. You will see, however, that the year start day is defined outside of the function in the file at the top. So year, day start, 20. The problem with this is we officially have a dependency. Day since requires that the year's day start has already been defined. So it's now dependent on the file that it's a part of. It is workable, it's not necessarily erroring. However, if we ever want to use days since and we've not done the config setup, then this function would actually error, right? Because you're trying to minus year's day end from something that doesn't exist. It'd be undefined. I'm gonna try to give a visual demonstration. Here we have the days since function, and because it has a dependency on the app, it is nested inside. However, app requires you set the start day, you set the user, and you set the password. Like I said, in most cases, this isn't actually a problem because for the use case that we want, it's satisfying it. We have to set up the app anyway, and then when we're in the app, maybe we'll do the day since function. Cool. But let's say a scenario comes up where we want to see two different dates. Maybe we now have a chat function and we want to see when the user last chat to a different user. Can we use the day start function? It gets sticky. Now, we might think, hey, let's just be lazy and reconfigure a new app, which honestly is kind of how some of these things start in the first place. You think, okay, I'll just use what's already there instead of refactoring the original code and not doing it from an atomic standpoint. And this is where these problems kind of like onion over the years, and then you have a code base. It's just crazy. But let's say that is an approach we wanted to do, okay? So we think, cool, we'll just set up the app. However, we'll just configure it with a different start date, which to be fair, isn't that much of a problem, I understand. However, in the config that we need to set up the app, you also need to set up the user and the password. What do? We don't have a user and password to use. So we think, okay, we'll just give it a dummy error. We'll set the username to blah and the password to blah too. Whatever, because we're not going to use it anyway, right? However, when you configure the app, it also runs another function to check if the user is valid. And because you're putting in a user that's not valid, it errors. Although the thing that's erroring isn't even the app, the authentication function's erroring. What we really have is days since, which calls the config in the app, which calls the authenticate errors, the app errors, and then the day since errors. Do you see this dependency chain we have now? We tried to run one function and we're getting an error 3 functions down and it's bubbling up. And this is the exact problem that you have with not making atomic components. Things are nested, it's hard to detangle them and you can't use it anywhere else. It's not reusable because unless I'm starting a completely new app, I can't actually use this code anymore. And do you know what the crazy thing is? It is super simple to solve. If we look at the code on screen now, you can see the days since function. There is only one difference. I have included the year day start variable in the input. So we just day since and we include the start date, and now this code will work anywhere. It's not going to error, it doesn't depend on anything else, it is atomic. It does one thing and nothing else. That is an example of functional components being reusable and how you can get into this stacked dependency how if you are not careful. Another thing it does is the reliability. Remember before when we tried to make a new app and everything was erroring and it wasn't even our main function, it was 3 functions down that were erroring and bubbling up. It's not reliable. And this honestly happens all the time in coding. Sometimes it's not avoidable, but you want to avoid it as much as you can. And it's very difficult when functions rely on other functions. Now, unit tests are a great litmus. And a unit test itself is like a functional programming approach. And it is a test that wraps around your code. It's like code that checks your code. What you would do is you would start the test, you would run your code and have an expected output. And then you check, is the result what I expected? If it's not, then the test fails. The beautiful thing about a functional component is it doesn't rely on anything else, which means every time we use the same inputs, we will always get the same outputs. Does that make sense? If I had a calculator app, so A plus B, every time I put in A plus B, the result will always be the result of A plus B. It's never going to be dependent on another number outside. The same inputs will always produce the same outputs, which makes it reliable. If it is reliable, then it is testable. And if your code is testable, it can become durable. So if every time we wanted to test our function, we had to run a setup, we don't know if the setup's failing. So for our example, are we calculating the days wrong? Is the config in the app not working? Is the app breaking for something? Is the authenticate method not working? These are the problems that happen. You don't know what you're even testing for because the test could fail and it's not even anything to do with the numbers and the days. It's not even related to the thing you were trying to test. It's everything around it. It can't be disconnected from. Hopefully now you understand what functional programming is and why someone would use it, especially in larger code bases. What are my 3 approaches to how you can know if something needs breaking down smaller? They're not technically rules, they're kind of checks because they're bendable, but just go through them every time you're not sure and you will get a better answer. Number 1, will I have to add more code if I want to do a unit test on this? If so, likely it's going to require some sort of setup to work. And if that's the case, it's not reliable. You know, if you have to every test do something to configure it, not reusable, is it? And basically that's just checking for if you need a config. Now, of course, some things will need setting up. However, if you actually have to develop code to make sure that you set something up properly, it's probably not atomic. Again, depends what you're testing, because if you wanted to test the whole app component, then fair. By definition, it relies on things. However, there are a lot of functions where you really don't need to do that. So for the days since, that shouldn't rely on anything. A calculator, that shouldn't rely on anything. Rule number 2, is this a good restriction? Sometimes you actually will be pigeonholed into certain config and it's not bad. So for example, if you have an app which accesses your database and you always wanted to access this one database, and you don't need an atomic function where it doesn't rely on other things because it's always going to rely on this one database. And if that doesn't work, you kind of want it to fail. And there might be a few different checks in there, checks if the database is working, blah, blah, blah. That's actually fine for this case because it's actually a good restriction because you don't want this function to be consumed in any other way. You don't want someone to take parts of it and put it on something else because you need it to only work for that database. It's a little bit ironic, but in the same way atomizing code is to make it reusable and accessible from anywhere, you sometimes don't want things accessed in any way. Sometimes you want them only used in a very specific flow, and as such, it's good to keep things contained. And then rule number 3 is could I not add any of the values it needs as inputs? I mean, look, sometimes there are just way too many, and putting it in the input of the function just wouldn't make sense. And that's fair, you have to make this call yourself. However, are you doing it because you're lazy? Because I've been a victim of this quite a few times. The adage that I use for this is, will it be easier when it's set up? Not how easy will it be to set up? So if you can do it once and then afterwards it's going to be much easier to use, it's probably worth the time, to be honest. So we are at the end of the video. Thank you guys for watching. Hopefully you've got a better idea about functional programming and these rules that I use to personally help me decide whether something needs breaking down smaller. If you have any other topics that you want me to cover, just hit me up and let me know. Otherwise, if you have any friends that are learning coding and maybe struggling with these kind of concepts, send them the video so they can make a more informed decision. Thanks, guys.